Hi, I'm Zeynep Coşkun, a research fellow at Sharq Forum. Today we are in Istanbul for a conference called Towards a New Security Architecture for the Mena region. I have a very distinguished guest with me, Mr. John Bell, who is the director of the Middle East Center of the Toledo International Center for Peace. Welcome, Mr. Bell.
How are you? Thank you very much. I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
We're good. What do you think of the conference so far?
I'm enjoying it. It's a rich discussion.
Is it
Lots
a new
of
topic?
different views, many different views, and yeah, it's a difficult topic actually, which is good. So you've challenged people to come up to speed. So
today, since we have you here and given your experience with international organizations, we want to talk with you about the role of international organizations in the new world order. In the world, we are now seeing the rise of strong populist leaders in Europe, in the Middle East, and also especially in the US, which are all weakening the international organizations. So we see like the EU and the UN and Brexit and all these things. We see the weakening of international liberal organizations. So the world order is changing. So what do you say on that?
well, I think you're first of all that you're right, that this is a new trend and it's rising and it's becoming literally more popular, because that's frankly the basis of the success of these people is populism. There are people voting or supporting them. So you're right about the trend. I'm afraid it does not bode well for international organizations or international order. And the reason for that I can think of are three, which are important, I think, to note. The first is that the politics become much more personality-based rather than institution-based. So the leaders will base their domestic policies on their personal views more than before. And secondly, they'll base their relations on personal views. Second, there'll be a lot more short-term thinking as a result of that, I think. Opportunistic deals, which again is sort of counter to some of what we've been used to for the last 50, 60 years, where there was an attempt to create more predictability in international order. So that personalization and the short-term thinking that comes with highly personalized leadership, authoritarians, are both very problematic for international order. International institutions will have a much harder time operating. The number of unknowns will be much greater.
So in this place, what's going to be the role of the UN in this new regional order?
Right, it's a very important question, because the UN is the child and was born through another order completely. And so the United Nations, unfortunately, is going to become handicapped by these new developments. I think there's no doubt about that. It has no choice, given that the United States is in that space now, along with another P5 country, possibly Russia, and therefore, or going into that space, the United States. Maybe it's not there fully at all. Those are two hugely important countries, and therefore the United Nations is going to be handicapped by this situation. Meaning it can become less and less a political organization. Not that it was ever that strong at that side of things, but believe it or not, I think this will mean it'll become less and less political over time, possibly more and more captive to the demands of certain of these new leaderships, which does not bode well for the United Nations. And the answer could be, in theory, reform. Which has been impossible to do at the highest levels and the most important levels of the United Nations until now, could still be very, very difficult, but that in the abstract is the only possible answer, is reform of the structure of the United Nations. I guess the question will be, how important is the United Nations to everybody in the future in this new arrangement in order for them to reform it or not? Obviously I don't have the answer, but one can ask the question.
And that's a very, very important question, because the UN gaining its independence also means like how much it's going to stay relevant, right? And the more it stays relevant, it's less likely that it's going to get independence. More it becomes irrelevant, then it's more likely to get independence. But then what can it do? And there comes the question, what it does now. Like, let's discuss that a little bit. Right now in the Middle East, since the 60s, there are like so many the UN missions and UN envoys that are operating, they're doing things, but we see little success. Right. If anything, maybe the Libyan Council might be the only thing that's close to a success right now. the UN envoys are doing. So given the limitations they have now, and now with the changing trends, what the UN can do for the Middle East?
Well, there's the reality, and then we could look at maybe what it could do on a more positive side. But the reality is, as I sort of just said, and you're echoing it, the United Nations is becoming more and more simply a technical organization. And its capacities are stretched, by the way. That's the other problem. And if the United States puts less money in due to their own isolationist trends, that'll create even larger problems. The United States is a huge contributor to the UN, create even larger problems for the United Nations and its capacities. So I could see realistically, on the realistic side, the United Nations, fortunately or unfortunately, becoming simply a technical toolbox for large powers in the region. One could argue, well, that's all it is right now. It's not quite true. Until now, the UN had some role that was a bit more political, did try to have that more, but that is fading, and it could become almost like purely a technical resource for whichever power convinces the UN to be involved with it, which is sad to some degree, but I think we do have to be realistic. I think there's another point to be made here, though, which is that, you know, if we go back to the beginning of your questions, a lot of these strongmen, the authoritarians, ultimately their power comes from their own populations. So without that, I mean, there are security systems involved, but there's a lot of legitimacy gained through their own populations. If those very populations, the citizens of those countries, see value in the UN, then that may be another story. So one way to sort of empower the UN is to give it more clear value to the very citizens involved in supporting authoritarians. Now, that is a very unclear thing. I think, for example, in the United States, there's probably a lot of people in the US who don't understand what the value of the United Nations is. So one way to empower the United Nations, even in the Middle East, is to revalue the United Nations for people, the ones who ultimately support strong leaders.
Thank you, Mr. Bell. This was very insightful.
Thank you.
Thanks
My
for
pleasure.
joining us in Istanbul today.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.